Hello everybody, we're going to make a start here. I hope you can hear me okay. Hello and welcome to this session on the care principles for Indigenous data governance, co-hosted by NSLA and OCLC. My name is Barbara Lemon, Executive Officer for NSLA. I would like to start by acknowledging Australia's First Nations peoples, the first Australians as the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which our many libraries and institutions do their daily work, preserving and sharing our heritage. And in my case, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I extend that acknowledgement and respect to the First Nations peoples of all nations represented in our very long list of attendees today, some 200 of you when we get you all on board, and particularly our speakers in the United States and New Zealand. So for those who don't know, NSLA is the peak body for Australia's national, state and territory libraries. Our 9 member libraries work collaboratively, and we have a long association with OCLC. So in a moment, we might pop up a slide and you'll be able to see the CEOs of our 9 libraries looking at you. But today's session will be hosted by OCLC's Merrilee Prophet. Merrilee will introduce her team and our guest speakers in just a moment. Don't worry, I think we don't have the slide to show you our CEOs, but we'll pop that up at the end. Oh, here they are. Welcome. Okay, well, look, as you know, a couple of brief comments. This session follows a previous OCLC webinar on operationalising care principles, and we're assuming that you've watched that webinar. This session is a follow-up session about the principles, the suite of traditional knowledge labels and their applicability in the Australasian context, importantly. So the first half of the session, we'll be hearing from our guest speakers, and then we'll be opening to Q&A. You'll see the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen, and you can write in your questions at any point during the session. Our OCLC moderators will be selecting questions to address to our panelists in the second half of the session, so please go ahead and write those in at any time. What we're really asking you to think about is how well or not your institution or library is applying principles of Indigenous data governance, that is ensuring that access to and use of data pertaining to Indigenous communities is governed by those communities. What's getting in the way of doing that? Could traditional knowledge labels be a solution for your library? How might they work in the Australasian context? And what information do you need? What more information do you need to improve Indigenous data governance at your place? So don't panic if your question isn't answered. Given the time constraints today, we'll have to select questions, but we will make a note of all questions and follow up with a blog post to address some of those. You can also use chat for informal comments, as some of you already are, which is terrific. This session will be recorded, as you can see, so do, if you wish to make your comments anonymous, you do have an option to do that. But we, of course, encourage free, full and frank discussion. Over to Merrilee now to introduce our speakers.
First, I need to find the unmute button, as is traditional. So welcome all. I just want to share a couple of slides. First, I want to introduce my teammates, Chayla Weber and Mercy Procaccini from the OCLC Research Library Partnership, and also to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Chochenyo-Ohlone people in what is now known as Oakland, California. The OCLC Research Library Partnership has, we're a unique transnational organization of about 120 institutions, including institutions in Australia. We have 4 major areas of focus, and we have one of our hallmarks is peer learning. We come together as a group to learn about the things that we don't know and to share knowledge about evolving practice. During 2020 and 2021, we have some additional areas which are focused on supporting institutions through COVID and also equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think, as you can see from the range of our practice areas, metadata, unique and distinctive collections, and research support, these are all areas where the care principles are terribly important, those types of collections and types of practices. So this is an extremely good topic topic for the Research Library Partnership. I want to thank you all. As Barbara said, over 200 people registered from right across Australia and New Zealand, and we're just so happy to have so many of you represented in today's discussion, and hope that you will add your voices in the Q&A for later. I want to take a moment to introduce and allow them to introduce themselves, our CARE team. Jane Anderson, Associate Professor, Department of Anthropology and Museum Studies from New York University. Stephanie Carroll, Assistant Professor and Associate Director at the Native Nations Institute, University of Arizona. Maui Hudson, Director of the Research Institute at the University of Waikato, and Maggie Walter, Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the University of Tasmania. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and allow you all to please introduce yourselves. Why don't we start with Jane?
Hi everybody, my name is Jane Anderson. I'm here in Lenape-Hoking, lands of the Lenape Nations in New York. We're getting battered by quite a significant snowstorm at the moment. I'd like to pay my respects to the ancestors and to the present and future generations and leaders of these lands, and to welcome you to this webinar. It's lovely to see you all.
Stephanie, maybe next.
Hi everybody, Sidak Atnakastan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll, Slandak Naltina Tissue Staff. I'm Stephanie Carroll. I'm Atna from the native village of Klutika along the Copper River in Alaska, USA. I'm coming to you today from the homelands of the Tanapam Nation and the Paskuyaki tribe here in Shuxon or Tucson, Arizona, USA. And I'm glad to be here with you all and pass it on to, I believe, Maui now.
Kia ora koutou katoa, nei rā tumihi kia koutou tēnei ahi. Kia ora, my name's Maui Hudson. I hail from the Whakatohia Nation, which is on the east coast of the North Island, around Opotiki. But I'm working out of the University of Waikato, which is in Hamilton, New Zealand, and this is the lands of Waikato Tainui.
I think that leaves me. So, yeah, Palingana. I'm Maggie Walter. I'm Palawa, and I'm lucky enough to be working in my home country here in Lutruwita, Tasmania. And it's great to be here for the webinar. And I pay my respects to our ancestors and the owners of the skies and the seas and the territories. Welcome.
So thank you all. We are so honored and grateful to have you with us to answer questions, to be a resource for those many librarians in practice who are hoping to expand their knowledge and also indeed share what their own journeys have been. In order to start things off, we've invited some folks from the National Library of Australia and also University of Sydney to share their experiences. So we'll be kicking off with a small group from the National Library who will, we have Kevin Bradley, Assistant Director of General Collections, Marcus Hughes, Director of Indigenous Engagement, Rebecca Bateman, Assistant Director of Indigenous Engagement. And we invite you to spend about 5 minutes telling us a little bit about your journey and your experiences thus far. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I shall kick off. I'm Kevin Bradley. I'm the Assistant Director General here at the National Library, and I look after the collections, which is a joy, and we're situated on the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people's lands here in Australia. So I thought, look, I'll just start with a little bit of an introduction and then hand over to my colleagues, Marcus and Rebecca. So after a decade of lobbying in the late 2019, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, or IATSIS, and the National Library of Australia succeeded in adding Auslan codes to the Library of Congress MARC codes list. Auslan is a definitive thesaurus of Australian Indigenous languages with over 1,200 records of language varieties developed by IATSIS. And where previously material in the Indigenous languages were catalogued under the catch-all Australian languages descriptor, adding AusLang identifies the specific language or languages used. You can search for particular Australian Indigenous languages in Trove now. During NAIDOC week in 2019, we talk as though 2020 is missing from the vocabulary in some ways, and maybe it feels like that. But in 2019, national and state libraries, Australian NSLA library staff and volunteers took part in the Codeathon, and by that week's end, 8,017 records in the Australian National Bibliographic Database received an AusLang Indigenous Australian language code with 465 unique languages represented in the total. We were overwhelmed with the amount of interest, and that interest has continued. So the completion last year of the library's project aimed at decolonising the description of our First Nations resources for published materials in conjunction with IATSIS. This project achieved development and implementation of guidelines for the decolonisation of the descriptions of published resources and the drafting of complementary guidelines for the decolonisation of descriptions of unpublished resources. Our implementation of AusLang codes in MARC was assisted by OCLC, thank you, updating their MARC specifications to allow for the codes to be correctly applied in OCLC records. COVID interrupted our work, however, the collaboration with IATSIS is recommencing this month, with representative from the National Library's Indigenous Engagement, Trove and Collection branch, meeting with IATSIS colleagues to discuss utilising the IATSIS subject thesaurus, further developing our descriptive guidelines for unpublished materials, and to discuss NSLA projects on Indigenous collecting and description. Rebecca Bateman, our first Indigenous curator, is a key driver and remains deeply involved in this work. And the library's structural reorganisation, which I won't go into, but I'm very pleased to say is nearing completion, has enabled the establishment of an Indigenous engagement section headed by Marcus Hughes. And I'd like to hand over to both Rebecca and Marcus.
There we go, we're unmuted. Hi, look, because we have such a limited amount of time, I'm just going to head straight to hand over to Rebecca. Thank you, Beck.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on the beautiful country of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples here in Canberra, to pay my respects to the land of all of the Indigenous people, the lands that people are dialing into us, joining us from today, and to acknowledge their elders past and present. I'd like to start by, I thought I'd start by talking a little bit more, bit of an introduction to myself. I'm a Walwan and Gamilaroi woman from the northwestern part of New South Wales, beautiful Macquarie and Castlereagh rivers up there. And obviously I live here on Ngunnawal country in Canberra and have done for a good number of years now. On that note, I wanted to start off by having a little bit more of a discussion into AusLang and the way that it's been used here at the library and in Trove to enhance the catalogue records of not just the National Library catalogue, but also the catalogue records from libraries across Australia via Trove. So I'm going to see if I can find my... Oh, fantastic. My apologies. So I wanted to start off by showing you this. This is an AusLang catalogue, an AusLang record. Rather, for those of you who aren't familiar with what AusLang looks like and what AusLang is, it's basically a database of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages developed and maintained by IATSIS. As you can see here, each of the several hundreds of languages in this database has an alphanumeric code, and that's been really important in the work that we've been doing here. In this case, this is the record for the Gamilaroi language, which is the language of my grandmother's people. And the code for Gamilaroi is D23. You can see that I've taken a shot here of the sort of introductory screen, the sort of front screen for the record for this language. And as you can see, it gives a whole slew of alternative spellings that have been used in documentation over the years that might show up in catalogue records as well. There are a whole range of other things that you could look at here, from programs. Is there anywhere where the language has been taught, for example? How many speakers are there of the language, fluently and otherwise? In what way has it been documented? And some information about where it's spoken and a few other things. So that, in a nutshell, is what Auslang looks like. It's an amazing resource for finding out about not only, you know, basic core information about languages, but also about the documentation of those languages, and, you know, how we can find out more about them. So this map shows you all of the language codes in Auslang. So each of those dots is a different language. As Kevin said, prior to the importing these codes into library catalogues via Trove, there was a single language code, and now there's one for every one of these dots. So it's an amazing, amazing thing. Where am I up to? So I wanted to talk about, in 2019, in the International Year of Indigenous Languages, we held a codathon, and this was a collaboration between the National Library, IATSIS, Trove, Libraries Australia, and of course the state and territory libraries here in Australia, to identify Indigenous Australian languages in catalogue records. It took place during NAIDOC Week in 2019, and it resulted in the addition of over 8,000 Auslang codes to records from libraries across Australia. And that represented 465 unique languages being represented in catalogue records that hadn't been before, which means, of course, people can search in catalogues by those languages and find material. So this was an amazing piece of work. It, like I said, happened over a week in 2019, but it's only just really the beginning. And so we have plans in the future. Now that we have an Indigenous engagement team, we're much better placed here at the library to, in the future, run another iteration of this kind of codathon or activity, this time with a focus on collaborating with Indigenous communities and individuals to use the process as a means of promoting data sovereignty. It's great that we've got the, you know, the metadata there now that identifies language material, but it's a great opportunity to make sure that Indigenous communities and peoples are having input into how that material is described and findable. And certainly the use of TK and BC codes could definitely work as powerful tools alongside Auslang and the codathon to further promote Indigenous data sovereignty in, you know, in library catalogue records in Australia. The other thing I wanted to talk briefly about was some work that has happened in Trove. Specifically, there have been enhancements made to Trove in the last 18 months to facilitate the identification of First Australian material in Trove, and to further give options around the way that material is, I guess, accessed and managed. So the first thing you'll notice, this is a what you're seeing on the screen now is a record for an item in Trove. It's a book called Culture and Translation, Anthropological Legacy of R.H. Matthews, pretty much a collation of Matthews' work that he did throughout New South Wales on a range of Indigenous languages. So The first thing I wanted to point out is up here, you'll see the little Coolaman icon. That's our First Australians icon, and as it obviously it says First Australians. That's appearing because this item has satisfied a set of criteria that have been applied to the metadata that identifies it as having Indigenous content. So that's tier 1 of this identification process. So we now know that this item has got Indigenous content. You'll also see, because it's been identified as such, that this down here is appearing, report culturally sensitive content, and again, our little Coolaman icon. And what that does is take you to a form where the user can then tell us if there's anything that we need to know about this item in terms of cultural sensitivities, that they believe we should be taking it down or shadowing it, or just be aware of something to do with it. So that gives a facility for people to feed back with cultural information about the material in the collection. And this applies not just to National Library material, but the material of any record that's in Trove that's been submitted by the partner libraries and organisations. So once an item like this is identified by applying a set of subject heading criteria to the metadata, there is another layer of identification, I guess you could say, that gets applied to the records as well. And that is around identifying material that could potentially be, particularly visual material, photographs and images that could potentially be sensitive and not appropriate to be seen. So, for example, deceased people, or depicting ceremony and other really sensitive material. And again, there's another set of criteria, subject headings that are applied that flag that kind of material. And when an item is identified by that set of criteria, the little thumbnail that you see here will actually be blurred. There will be an option to unblur it and to go ahead and see the item. But in the first instance, the user will get an indication that that's occurred and why that's occurred. So it's just another level of, I guess, bringing cultural and intellectual, cultural property and law to the way that we describe material and make it available. And they're all steps in a process that promotes Indigenous data sovereignty, both within Trove and within the broader library sector in Australia. Unless, Marcus, you have anything to add?
No, I think that's fine.
I think we'll...
Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. We've had a robust discussion in chat, a lot of approving and kind of a lot of positivity there, as well as some questions. I do apologize. Our care team does have a brief presentation, so before turning to Q&A for NLA, I think we're going to rewind the tape a bit and invite the care colleagues to please go ahead and share your own prepared remarks. So why don't you go ahead and take it away?
If you can unshare the last one, I can share this one. Yes.
Thank you for taking a step back. So Maui's going to be our slide master, and he'll speak at some point. But I'm going to start us off. And we just wanted to give some refocus to care, particularly as an update to the webinar that Jane and I gave that you were all provided the link to, which was, I don't know, possibly 6 months ago now. It seems like forever, but yesterday. So we're focusing, on Indigenous data sovereignty, the rights of people, Indigenous peoples to govern their knowledge and data from generation and storage to use and reuse, and concerns about secondary use of data and limited opportunity for benefit sharing really has focused attention on the tension that Indigenous communities, as you've heard here, have felt between protecting Indigenous rights and interests in Indigenous data, including traditional knowledges and languages, and supporting open data, machine learning, broad data sharing, big data initiatives, and storage of data elsewhere. So as these advances take place and we move towards increased access to complex and big data for innovation discovery and for decision making, the rights to control and access data for Indigenous peoples within these data environments is limited and becomes increasingly so. So the CARE principles, which focus on collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, empower Indigenous peoples by shifting the focus from this regulated consultation to values-based relationships that really position our data approaches within Indigenous cultures and knowledge systems to the benefit ultimately of Indigenous peoples. So ultimately CARE and the CARE principle should be seen as a required dimension of repositories and collections that work to ensure that stewardship and use of data align with Indigenous rights, and that work to have data be as open as determined by Indigenous communities, that the use and storage is purposeful, and that enhances the well-being of Indigenous peoples. Next slide, Maui. So the CARE principles really apply across the data lifecycle. So for instance, practicing care and data collection requires defining cultural metadata and recording provenance. And then engaging care and data stewardship necessitates using appropriate governance models and making data fair. So findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. And we really need data to be fair so that all of the data held by others can also be accessed and used by Indigenous peoples as well. And that our provenance issues and protocols as well as permissions are linked to data in perpetuity. So less clear and worthy of exploring are how to implement care criteria in the data community and how to use fair and care in data applications. Next slide. So currently used mechanisms that can reflect and enact the CARE principles include tribally based tools, such as tribal codes or guidelines, research review processes, data sharing agreements, but also these tools that we've heard about so far and we'll hear more about, which are employed by other institutions, such as repository policies, requirement for proof of permission to deposit data and more, as well as infrastructure tools or data infrastructure tools, such as metadata labels and collection notices, which we've already heard about and I think we'll discuss far more. But more tools are needed, as well as criteria to assess and evaluate how other institutions are enacting the CARE principles. Next slide, Maui. Thanks. So to reinforce the operationalization of CARE, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance and collaborator initiatives are supporting co-production of policies, practices, and tools to implement the CARE principles. And these are focused around designing CARE criteria for implementation. So these would be a set of indicators for each principle. And some indication of the prioritization of components. So within those principles, which indicators are required as essential to implementing CARE, which are very important for implementing CARE, and which are useful for implementing CARE, but not essential. Developing trainings on various elements related to Indigenous data, sovereignty and governance for Indigenous peoples as rights holders in this environment, and then for other stakeholders such as repositories, libraries, and others. Supporting Indigenous governance efforts by First Nations, promoting alternative licensing and agreement systems that support communities in their engagement with these external data systems. And then creating and expanding mechanisms for provenance, permission, and protocols such as data standards, traditional knowledge, and biocultural labels and notices. So they're more within these data infrastructures, they're changing the systems themselves through the application and use.
Cool. And so I'm kicking in here now with really just thinking through how the CARE principles then get applied and what sorts of mechanisms might be used. And we're using the TK labels in this instance, partly because it's one of the things that Jane and myself have been working on quite closely and broadening that network. But the way the labels are set up to allow for communities to customize them really gives them the authority to control how they're represented. and that it remains visible in the record, so that their relationship with that material and their preferences in terms of ethics and protocols as it relates to that material is really visible and transparent. And the best example of that is one you may have seen or heard as we've talked about this, but it's the one at the Library of Congress. And you'll see here a record that was fairly impoverished, didn't have too much information about the community from which this war song and these recordings came from. But through a process of engagement between the institutions and the Passamaquoddy themselves, they were able to bring forward a lot more traditional knowledge, a lot more Indigenous knowledge to enrich the record. And one of the reasons they were comfortable with that was because the traditional knowledge labels were really visible in that place. And so it was really clear to anyone that was then engaging with that material who needed to be, what the attribution was supposed to look like, and that they were approving it for use for outreach and educational purposes, but not for commercial purposes. And so this provides an element which gives you a sense of control over the material, even though it is still available in a public record. And so this is the really the forward-facing part of the work, but in the background, it's all these questions around metadata and where this information sits. And so one of the things that happened around this project with the Library of Congress is that the traditional knowledge labels were recognised as parts of the rights advisory and were allowed to sit alongside the intellectual property rights held by Harvard Museum. So recentering the relationships as first rights, as cultural intellectual property rights, which are things which communities have been asking for a long time, that kind of recognition. Alongside that was the need to work out where it would sit within the digital infrastructures. And so part of that was, how does it fit in relation to Dublin Core? And you'll see that the traditional knowledge labels have been located here within the rights fields. And similarly within the database itself, and one of the great outcomes from this piece of work that was done with the Passamaquoddy is now that any item within the Library of Congress could have traditional knowledge labels attached to them. And so this is where an activity which can happen because it's the right thing to do with a community makes changes in an infrastructure which allow those activities to be done into the future without having to recreate that same level of effort that's required. And so alongside the labels, because in the context of care, we have this bit that's around the authority, and the labels provide that for communities. But you also have the responsibility of institutions to indicate that they need to do work. And so that's where the notices come in, because it allows institutions themselves to put something in place, either through the cultural institution labels, just recognizing that they are open to collaborate and that they recognize that the attributions which they have in place on their existing records are incomplete. And then also acknowledging specific relationships which they know exist around traditional knowledge or biocultural material, which have yet to be developed. And so you can put the notice on, recognizing that, and that can allow you to start working on some of the infrastructure pieces, which then makes space for the labels to emerge as the relationship with the community develops in that direction. And I'll pass on to Maggie.
Thanks, Maui and Steph. So my piece in this is talk about how we're trying at the University of Tasmania to build traditional knowledge labels and notices into our Indigenising of the curriculum. So I've been charged with leading the Indigenisation of the curriculum through the university, but starting with the Bachelor of Arts. And this is not to give you a detailed overview, but just to look at how this is done and the care principles apply. So we're starting off with two key flagship units, I guess, which is life worlds, society, sovereignty and justice. And with these two, there's another humanities version. Every first year BA student is being offered one of these units as part of their BA. So the idea is to bring in students right from the start with a recognition of Indigenous knowledges. And you can see the TK labels up there at the top that we will be attaching to at least a significant proportion of the resources and content that we use within this unit. So that's what you've got there, is just a little bit of an overview of the unit outline and what students read about what they will be learning about. And as you can see, it's about Palawa. So we take a very place-based approach. So if you, next slide, please, Maui. Okay, so applying the care principles to it, you can see that we've been able to use these sort of principles right across a number of ways we actually work the unit up. And it's been invaluable for me in actually getting through to fellow producers, but also people throughout the university as to why we're doing it this way. So on collective benefit, this is all about Palawa voices. So Palawa voices are prioritised. The narrative that we're telling people about the Indigenous life world is Palawa defined. And what we do is we invite students to come in on a journey into the Palawa life world. And that's the premise on which they enter. All our content is Palawa where possible, and we have commissioned key content from Palawa elders and knowledge holders. And certainly all traditional labels and traditional notices will be applied to all of those materials. And we've also created a credential teaching resource, which is a Palawa resource pool, where we've pulled together everything we can find from public as well as other sources to make available. And all of these resources will have links and protocols around them. So people, non-Indigenous staff especially, going in can make a decision about how they should be using that material, rather than just go for their usual. So it's what we're trying to change the paradigm and stop the usual way of just going in and grabbing whatever's handy and whatever seems relatively unconfrontational. Authority to control, it is Palawa Indigenous led at all stages, from conception right through to the end. So that's me this year, but I'm sharing it with my other Indigenous colleagues, and other years, other people will take over, but it's always Indigenous led. We've developed a set of new contracts, a big step away for the University of Tasmania, who usually use the standard old IP contracts. So any of our content that we're having from our commissioned, from our Palawa elders and knowledge holders is now under these new contracts, which means they still own the IP, the university doesn't. All we do is we have the right to share that knowledge for the next 4 years, and only in these 2 units. We can't use it for other purposes. So and they also have the ability to put in their own specific protocols around how their knowledge is to be used. We're trying a new way of actually running our units. So any of you could thinking back to your uni days and your sort of long lectures with somebody boring you up the front and then, or PowerPoint slide after PowerPoint slide, we're not doing that. We're doing everything online just about. It's curated. So we're actually letting the voices and the materials speak for themselves. So rather than us interpreting what other people have said, we're actually presenting it there with just those linkages from the teaching teams. And all our teaching teams are a combination of Indigenous and non-Indigenous academic staff. Responsibility, our units centre around 4 virtual tours of country. So they've all been created especially for this unit, and they most definitely will have the TK notices and labels applied to them. But that really just emphasises that's where the centre of the Indigenous life world. We start with a welcome to country in week 1 from a Palawa elder, and that emphasises that when students are invited in, it's an invitation to come to somebody's home. That means you're welcome in the public spaces of the home, but you're not welcome to go and open all the drawers or have a look in the bedrooms. You know, this is It's about respecting when you come into the life world about what is appropriate for you to see and what isn't. And then at the end of the unit, we have an on-country experience with, if COVID permitting, where we take students out on country with knowledge holders. Again, that reinforces responsibilities about entering the Indigenous life world. Finally, our ethics. Yes, our notices and labels will be applied. There are strict restrictions around access to content now and future. Students can stream the virtual tours, for example. They cannot download them. Every year, I know I'll be assailed by lots of students wanting to download. The answer will always be no. We also have a set of protocols that apply for presenting in the unit. And I have to say my colleagues within the BA have been very, very enthusiastic about this. One thing they're not so enthusiastic about, but they will do, is one of the protocols is that everybody has to name up their mob. So when we do our little film bit where we introduce ourselves to our students, we have to say who we are and where we're from. And that applies equally to non-Indigenous staff as it does to Aboriginal staff. And it's interesting how people are really open to the big things, but they find some of the little things, such as naming up who they are as non-Indigenous people in Australia, quite challenging. But that's just a brief overview. I'll stop there and move on for Jane, but I'm happy to answer any questions a bit later on.
Thanks, Maggie and Steph and Maui. I'm just going to follow up and be really quick in relationship to kind of thinking about responsibility and what these kind of decolonial futures can look like for institutions. And I guess this is the kind of practical part. How do we make that happen? What does that look like? What are the tools that people need? And we kind of have 4 things really: how to implement the practical mechanisms, thinking about the development of peer-to-peer cultural institution networks that can share their experiences, training and support, and thinking about care principles, policy and adoption. And just in this slide, I've got an example of one of the notices being used at Simon Fraser University in their library system there. It's one of their, in the Haida collection, it's one of their largest hits, is looking for Haida material, and they've got the Open to Collaborate notice that they've decided to use there to help people know that they're working with the Haida to properly label, catalogue and build into their infrastructure proper recognition of Haida rights. Maui, next slide. So this is the hub that is in beta. It's nearly ready for testing in terms of delivering both the labels for communities, but also the notices for institutions. And also really key to the local context hub is thinking about these relationships, the relationships across communities, durational relationships, temporal relationships across time that are needed to build the obligations and responsibilities that institutions need to have to Indigenous communities. And we're starting to build that within this particular context. And so we'll be looking for testers on that as we go. I should say, oh yeah, so maybe the next slide, Maui. So one of the things that we built actually during COVID was a cultural institutions network. We have over 56 cultural institutions that are part of this network at the moment across 13 states in the US and across 7 countries. And I encourage you, if you're interested in hearing what other institutions are doing and creating a way of communicating and thinking through what those next steps can be and learning off each other, I would encourage you to get in contact with Gwen Saul at New York State Museum, who's the chair of the Cultural Institutions Network. That's where, work that Maggie's doing at UTAS, that's work that's happening at University of Queensland, and a shout out to Mia Strazek-Barker, who I know is here at the moment doing amazing work up there, implementing the labels for a project with Udjuru Nunukul and the North Stradbroke Museum. Just the ways in which different institutions are taking on these questions and starting to do the work that is required within those contexts. And that's a really important space for experimentation and thinking and pushing and moving the work that's required within an institutional context. The other key component is thinking about what kinds of support services are required for institutions to do this work. We have multiple modules that we run in relationship to Indigenous collections and intellectual property, practical mechanisms and like the labels and the notices, agreements and decision making. And as Steph alluded to at the beginning of this talk, larger modules around Indigenous data sovereignty and governance and the care principles are being developed, particularly through GIDA at the moment as well. Last slide, Maui. And the final part is thinking about how within your institutional context, you can start to embed the care principles as policy. This is IATSIS's latest guidelines for research in Indigenous studies. You can see here within Indigenous knowledge and data, they've embedded thinking about the care principles as a core dimension of responsibility and practice around Indigenous data and Indigenous knowledge. So this is kind of one way in which an institutional step can start moving forward into the movement of developing practice around practical mechanisms. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. We have just a few final, I think we have some words from Jennifer Stanton at the University of Sydney was going to share a little bit about their journey and where you all are. Jennifer is the manager of digital collections. Jennifer, we'll see if we can hear you.
Hello, how are you? Yay!
Brilliant.
Wonderful. So hi everyone, I'm at the University of Sydney Library, which is on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. At the University of Sydney Library, we're aiming to embed culturally safe practices into what we do. This will involve being mindful of Indigenous cultural intellectual property, as well as encouraging ethical use of First Nations cultural knowledge and culturally appropriate research practices. In terms of our metadata and collections, we want to be inclusive, ensuring that we go beyond the colonial perspective while respecting cultural sensitivities and IP. We want to combine this with upholding access to information and alignment with standards. We want our staff to be supported in the decision-making processes related to Indigenous data governance, and for these processes to be inclusive and go outside the walls of our institution to involve communities. In moving towards our goals, we've come a long way in the last 5 years. We started in a position where there seemed to be a lot of in-house decisions that came out of ad hoc processes. I'll use Thesis Digitization as an example. Firstly, our records most of the time won't indicate if there is Indigenous data in the thesis or if it contains culturally sensitive information. We can try and make that call off the table of contents or keywords, and occasionally we might find a note on the thesis itself that states contains women's business. This was one of the biggest barriers I think we have to face, trying to retrospectively make decisions based off records that don't contain the information that we need. In terms of what we would then do if we thought the item did contain culturally sensitive information, unfortunately in the past, we might have gone ahead and digitized the thesis and made it available regardless, or we might have contacted the Department of Anthropology for advice. Decision-making was very limited, and we wouldn't extend our search for answers beyond the walls of the university. On top of this, when we did make a decision, there wasn't a process in place for recording that decision or any actions that were taken. You might be lucky to find a saved email sitting on a shared drive somewhere. This fed back into the lack of useful records regarding Indigenous data. There are two seminal steps which we have taken so far that I think will have a long-lasting impact on Indigenous data governance at our library. The first of these is cultural competence training, which was implemented at a university level. Completion of this training helped our staff feel more confident in participating in conversations about Indigenous data governance and to question long-standing practices. My own experience is that from this training, open discussions are becoming the norm. While completing the training does not mean we're in a position to do a lot of decision-making, it does mean that now when we find items in our collection that we have some questions about, we have an open conversation to discuss how we might move forward, and if there are any interim measures we might make while we search for a better long-term decision. The second of these are the very recent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural protocols, which were created by the library's Wingara Mura group, which was led by Nathan Sentence, a Wiradjuri man who is working with the library as the Wingara Mura advisor. These protocols, which will soon be available on our library website, are intended as a set of principles and guidelines to enhance and embed culturally competent practice within an Australian academic library context. They focus on things like identifying potentially sensitive First Nations cultural materials, dealing with takedown requests relating to culturally sensitive materials, and how we should approach involving communities in the decision-making process. Now that the protocols have been endorsed by the University Executive Indigenous Strategy and Services Committee, our library will begin implementation of these protocols into our systems, procedures, and culture. While we await implementation of the protocols, some smaller things that we have implemented include a cultural care warning on our digital collections website so that visitors are aware that they may encounter culturally sensitive materials, and we will soon have this available on all of our library websites. We've also put cultural care warning notice on individual digitised items, mainly theses. This warning is quite high level at the moment, as we don't yet have a decision-making process in place to identify the exact issues and inform a more specific warning. Importantly, while we don't have a decision-making process in place, we are documenting items as we find them that we want to review down the track. To aid discoverability, we've been improving the metadata in our catalogue by adding in Auslan codes when an item includes a particular First Nations language or research about that language. In a recent repository upgrade, we have added the ability for submitters to select a First Nations language as the language of the item they are submitting. In terms of issues or barriers, there are a number we have faced, but I wanted to highlight two in particular. The first is that there is no blanket solution when it comes to working with communities, as First Nations communities in Australia are incredibly diverse. Trying to work out who to speak to, or even who to speak to find out who to speak to, can be difficult and it will take time. As an organisation, we need to be organised enough to have a central communication office who can be the experts in this area. This will enable relationship building and keep things on track. The second I found is that as we harvest more and more content and information, we may not have a lot of control over the items that appear from a client perspective to be in our collection. This means that if we are notified of a record missing Indigenous attribution that appears to be on our federated search catalogue, it might not be that easy for us to fix. If we are to be really successful with Indigenous data governance, it would help to have every single person creating content and records on board, which is quite a barrier. At the same time, we can look at being more discerning about the content that is being harvested by our search tools and prioritise content coming from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations like IATSIS. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Just as a reminder, we're coming close to the close of the hour here. This session is being recorded. We will distribute a link to the recording. So if you need to jump off a few minutes early, that's fine. We also have, I see that our care team is in the Q&A and is answering some of the questions live. I think that we did have a couple of the questions that we wanted to put to some of our speakers. And Chayla, I think you had a couple of those queued up. And then we'll try to round up some of the questions and get those answered offline for distribution afterwards.
Sure. So since we only have a minute or two left here, I think I'll just start by combining. We had a couple of questions about thinking about implementing responsibly and consulting respectfully. One of the questions has started to be addressed in the typed answers, but one person talks about not having Indigenous staff or representation within their library workforce, although having some resources at the university, and wondering who they should be looking for guidance to make sure they implement appropriately. And then there was another question about sort of how they might implement appropriately without clear cultural authorities to work with. Does somebody from the care team want to address that?
I will first, from an Australian point of view. Unfortunately, within our universities and our other institutions, there are rarely staff, Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander staff available to provide this sort of expertise. Now, obviously, we do want people to, under the, one of the foundational principles of Indigenous data governance is Indigenous leadership and decision making. So if you do not have appropriate staff, you need to think about a mechanism by which you can have that leadership and decision making. I want to stress that is not an advisory group, that is not a consultory group. Those things are so 1990s, and we know that they're no longer applicable. You can't have leadership or decision making with an advisory group or a consultative group. The other risk on the other side of that, however, is that yes, you have Aboriginal academics and Torres Strait Islander academics and staff within your institution. We have to be really careful that we don't overburden those staff. It's a common, working with an institution myself, I know it is very common for us to be pulled in and expected to deliver all sorts of things all over the place. And while most of the time we're keen to do that, as an institution, you have to be very careful that you don't overburden your Aboriginal academics who are not employed. They've already got full-time jobs. So it's finding that, that middle road and probably talking with your senior Aboriginal colleagues as to how you can best implement it is probably the place to start. That's from me. It's over.
Terrific. Does anybody else want to jump in on that, or shall we? Okay, I'm going to hand it back over to Marilee to close us out since we're at the top of the hour.
Yes, we are. Thank you so much, all of you, participants, speakers, librarians. I want to thank you for bringing your inquisitiveness and your energy, and for this is challenging work. And I think you can see from the attendance on this webinar how really interested librarians are to learn more about their collections and learn more about responsible stewardship of those collections. And I want to thank the CARE team for giving some tools to our colleagues at University of Sydney and at the National Library of Australia for helping to situate some of this work and to help share just even the beginning steps of how to think about this work and how to go forward with it. We will be following up with a blog post, I think, with some of the, try to get some of the answers to the questions that remain unopened and send that out to you along with the recording to this. Barbara, do you have anything else to say in close?
Just a huge thank you to everyone, and to reiterate that, and particularly we'll work with the National Library for those National Library focused questions to see if we can get some answers into that blog post too. And thanks to all our speakers from the States and New Zealand, Aotearoa. It's wonderful to have such a big group join us today, so stay tuned.
Yes.